Welcome, everybody, to the second last installment of the Democracy series that has been hosted by the Rosa-Luxemburg-Stiftung. I believe the last one will be announced probably at the end of the webinar. Today, we have Patrick Bond joining us, and my name is Sikho Luthango, and I'm a program manager here at the Rosa-Luxemburg-Stiftung. Today, the dialogue series is aimed at critically discussing the different and interconnected threats that democracy is suffering currently. And we also aim at discussing pathways for transformative democratic social contracts in the context of the current global poly-crisis, which Patrick will elaborate more on. Patrick's presentation will be focusing on how methane capitalism specifically and the climate crisis are eroding democracy, and will propose pathways for a more transformative democracy in South Africa and globally. He will look closely at the role of imperial and sub-imperial forces in the ecological crisis and how they are affecting democracy globally. I would like to just briefly introduce Patrick, and then after that, I will also just elaborate on the structure of today's discussion. Patrick Bond is a political economist and political ecologist. He teaches at the University of Johannesburg, where he is a distinguished professor of sociology and director of the Center for Social Change. He has written or edited a half a dozen books and booklets and several dozen articles and chapters on BRICS, in part while serving as a host of BRICS from Below, which is civil society and scholarly gatherings in Durban 2013 and Johannesburg 2018 and 2023. So Patrick will be joining us for a presentation from now until about 2:35. And then from there on, we will take a look at his debate, which will be, he'll be debating Rick Wolff, who is a left supporter of BRICS, and Patrick himself, a left critic of BRICS. And we will be live streaming that until 3 p.m. And then Patrick will join us once again from 3 p.m. Patrick, can I hand over to you?
Yes, it's absolutely delightful to be with Rosa Luxemburg, and I'm very, very confident Sikho will manage this quite complicated shifting process that starts us off with a video that I hope will set the mood. The mood that I'd like to create is one of friction and tension and rhetoric, and the ability that we have, I think, to work within a broad left where there are two currents, and one current, critics call it campus. You're going to see the most eloquent exposition of a position on the climate catastrophe and global climate policy. I'll take what I think is a second position, the first sometimes called campus, the second independent left, which is actually critical of a third worldist, but particularly a pro-BRICS standpoint that you're going to see. And the reason to set it up like this, and we'll have Vijay Prashad coming in. He's the head of the Tricontinental, formerly a professor of history in Connecticut, of Indian origin. And he's the most eloquent. I think in so many ways he picks up Samir Amin's legacy. But on the other hand, you'll see that the kind of debate we want to get going revolves around whether a climate catastrophic policy that is at the global scale, as well as very local to us, whether that will come from a BRICS plus contributing and indeed amplifying that crisis, or instead we can get a climate justice process. And particularly the period between 3 and 4 p.m. after the debate, live debate on Democracy Now! In New York with Rick Wolff, a great old friend who's one of the, well, maybe the most eloquent, charismatic Marxist economists of our day. We'll debate this question of what's been happening in Kazan, Russia, the last 3 days, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. The BRICS met, and Thursday was a broader outreach meeting. And our objective is to leave you with some questions about whether there will be a multipolar arrangement, or whether the BRICS plus sit comfortably within a Western-dominated multilateralism. Here today, we use the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, but we'll have lots of other examples as well. The International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization. If I were cheeky, I would even say that Zurich mafia that handles, multilateral soccer, FIFA, where South Africa in 2010, Brazil in 2014, and Russia in 2018 were the villains and the victims, right, of wrecking our experience with the game we love, soccer, by hosting FIFA as a sub-imperial power. Let's take it, instead of me babbling about the way I'd like us to eventually engage in a very participatory way. Let's go quickly to our dear comrade, Vijay Prashad, and then we'll try to unpack his line of argument. So Vijay is starting off here in Glasgow. It's 2021, and he's really charismatic. And we get the full screen, the full effect.
When I listen to Boris Johnson, when I listen to people like Joe Biden, when I listen even more to Emmanuel Macron, all I can think of is how condescending you are. Glasgow was the UK's second most important city. Beautiful buildings, beautiful streets, a gorgeous city. When I see cities like this, I think also about the other side of it. You know, there's a phrase from Walter Benjamin, every monument of civilization is also a monument of barbarism. I think of the famines in Bengal, the jute workers in Bengal sending jute to Dundee through the Glasgow port. I think of human beings from Africa enslaved and brought from Ghana to the New World, and all those prophets getting sucked into cities like London and Glasgow. You know, between 1765 and 1938, the British Isles stole $45 trillion pounds from India, 45 trillion sterling from India. We never got paid for that. When the British left India, when we threw the British out, our literacy rate was 13%. So much for several hundred years of so-called civilization. Meanwhile, our landscapes were destroyed. You know, coal was foisted on India. You foisted coal on us. You were the ones that came and made us coal dependent. And then you left, and now you dare to condescend to us. When I listen to Boris Johnson, when I listen to people like Joe Biden, when I listen even more to Emmanuel Macron, all I can think of is how condescending you are. You condescended to us 400 years ago. You condescended to us 300 years ago. You condescended to us 200 years ago. You condescended to us 100 years ago. You're condescending to us today. You only know condescension because for you, colonialism isn't something that happened in the past and we defeated you. It's not that. For you, colonialism is a permanent condition. And that permanent condition happens in two ways. There's the permanent condition of the colonial mentality. You want to lecture us. You want to tell us that we are responsible for all the problems because you'll never accept that you're the one principally to blame. You signed the Rio Formula in 1992 on common and differentiated responsibilities. You like the common part. You like the common part. You like to say we're all in this together and so on. We're not in this together. The United States, 4-5% of the world's population, still uses 25% of the world's resources. You outsource production to China, and then you say China is the carbon polluter. China's producing your buckets. China's producing your nuts and bolts. China's producing your phones. Try to produce it in your own countries and see your carbon emissions rise. You love lecturing us because you have a colonial mentality. Then there are colonial structures and institutions. You lend us money, and every time you lend us money, which is our money, every time the International Monetary Fund comes to our societies and they tell us, here's the money we are giving you. No, it's our money. You give us our money back as debt, and then you lecture us about how we should live. Climate justice movement is a movement that says we're worried about our future. What future? What future? Children in the African continent, in Asia, in Latin America, they don't have a future. They don't have a present. They're not worried about the future. They're worried about their present. Your slogan is, we're worried about the future. What future? That's a middle-class bourgeois Western slogan. You got to be worried about now. 2.7 billion people can't eat now. And you're telling people, reduce your consumption. How does this sound to a child who hasn't eaten in days? You've got to clue into this, guys. You've got to clue into this. Otherwise, this movement will have no legs in the third world.
Now, that was brilliant. I wonder if we'll all celebrate the way we've got in our broader anti-imperialist movement such an extraordinary resource, not just Vijay Prashad, but his tricontinental. Now, I told you that that's one perspective, and you might have heard a couple of things about the IMF that we need to interrogate, but this is not the topic of today's event. We're talking climate. But what is important is that the IMF is essentially reconstituting with not just white male leadership and not just the ownership purely under the thumb of the United States. Sure, the US can exert veto. The Europeans are vastly overweighted. But the crucial thing that Vijay doesn't tell you is that in 2015, the IMF expanded quite dramatically. And the IMF expansion included China increasing by 35%, and Brazil by 23%, and India by 11%, and even Russia by 8%. But when these middle layer countries, I'm going to call them sub-imperialists, not anti, but sub, when they come into the IMF, they take more of the voting share. So who loses voting share? Because there's 100% voting share, and now China's gone up to around 6%, a 35% increase. So who do they step on? If you're standing on somebody's shoulder, you're pushing them down. And that's unfortunately what the BRIC countries, I left South Africa out of this one, because South Africa lost voting share. Nigeria lost. How much? Nigeria and Venezuela lost 41%. South Africa lost 21%. And plenty of other African countries in between lost vast shares. Why? Because as the BRICS move up, they stand on other poor countries' shoulders, claiming to speak for them. Now, I know the IMF quite well, and I can tell you that Vijay had to, honestly admit that new leadership, an Indian in the World Bank at the moment named Ajay Banga, who practiced his predatory finance here in Soweto 11 years ago. I've written extensively about this case where he worked with what became Cash Paymaster Services, a guy called Serge Bellamont, his Net1, which was 22% owned by the World Bank, and put on debit orders. I'm sure all of you in the crowd from South Africa, you know those social grants with a steady collateralizable income stream getting, let's say, bloated up with debit orders. So at the end of the day, if you're a granny and you're supposed to get your 2,000 rand a month, it's down to 100 because there's so many debit orders. Now, there's a wonderful story about that, in a sense, the way the assimilation by MasterCard, who eventually Ajay Banga was the CEO for, and now World Bank president, but they assimilated a leading young Indian, that is Ajay Banga, and brought him right up into the point where he was the major vehicle in the early 2010s to put this debit order, let's call it a debt trap on the poorest of South Africans. 17 million actually were subject to this debit order, and it's basically cured, as we'll talk about, by social resistance, by Black Sash, and by social movements that rose up and said, no more debit orders, no more cash paymaster services. You have to kill the company, which in 2020 did happen. They were declared bankrupt because they couldn't pay the fines for all of their illicit activities. That puts, I think, in context what I feared Vijay does there. He's a great guy, total admiration, but he hides behind the poor. Hides behind the poor. It's a funny phrase. It comes from Praful Bidwai, a mutual friend of ours. Praful was worried when he worked at Greenpeace that the Indian government, then the Congress government, was basically like South Africa's government saying, we're a poor country. You West, you've polluted too much. Therefore, we have the right to keep polluting. The problem is, hiding behind the poor means that Manmohan Singh, you'll see him in a minute, but also he was the prime minister at the time, but also the current prime minister since 2014, Narendra Modi, they'll often have the kind of anti-Western, anti-imperialist rhetoric that says, you in the West have over-emitted. Of course, no one will deny that. I'll show you the stats in just a moment. But the crucial question, are you hiding behind the poor? So your big companies, the Adani Group, which has privatized the Haifa port, and therefore that's the biggest port in Israel, therefore allowing the material to commit genocide to come into Israel. South Africa, the #1 coal exporter from Richards Bay to the Hadera port in Israel, fueling the genocide. You see what I'm saying? There may be some good government policies, South Africa against Israeli genocide, but the crucial question is a class analytical question. And we have Rosa Luxemburg to thank for tuning us in. What I want to do now is give you a little sense from the dreaded PowerPoints of how I would frame this. So if you'll allow me, I hope everyone was able to see a screen that has the advertisement for this event. And if you can see that screen, you'll next see what I think will be the most important part of the discussion, where all of you in the House will come in after 3 p.m., where we talk about social resistance. The EJ Atlas measures what is an environmental justice movement. So my second complaint about VJ, which follows the fact that he doesn't recognize that the BRIC countries are part of the worsening of IMF power, right? They're not resisting. Their leaders in the IMF are part of the problem. I can tell you all the names and addresses. But particularly when we look at resistance, he was very critical of a movement which he called climate justice. And he was talking to the white Glasgow audience. But the EJ movement, the environmental justice, starting really in the global south, a place called North Carolina, where there were toxic waste dumps. And an African-American researcher named Robert Bullard really brought this movement into the focus, not in the global south, but in the global north. But these terms are so fluid. The global south within the global north. African-American neighborhoods subject to racism. An EJ Atlas was put together by a man not in Ecuador, although he's done a lot of work there, but in Spain, Joan Martinez Allier, working with the Ecuadorian group Acción Ecológica. And in our context, we've got plenty of resistance movements that do not accept the charge that VJ leveled, which is that the CJ movement, climate justice, one part of the broader EJ scene, is insensitive to the urgent needs to end poverty and discrimination of all sorts in the global south. Now, the global south, unfortunately, is being now portrayed, even though the biggest part of it is Russia, essentially historically a European country. But that global south, right, is now represented by a BRICS 10. One of the 10 countries is Saudi Arabia. It hasn't quite joined. It didn't quite agree to full membership on January 1. And it's playing footsie ever since, because their leader, Mohammed bin Salman, a terrible dictator, is probably going to go into an alliance with the United States that's much stronger, even than have existed to date, if Trump wins the US presidential election in about 12 days' time. Now, that question as to where Saudi Arabia goes is important, because as you see, 51% of global emissions are coming from the 10 countries. And Saudi Arabia, after China, after India, after Russia, after Iran, is the 5th. Brazil 6th, South Africa 7th, Egypt and UAE. And the only one with really negligible emissions is Ethiopia. But 9 out of the 10 are basically carbon-addicted economies. And the expansion of the BRICS didn't have to be, in that sense, so let's say, oriented towards West Asia, to the Middle East. But it was the geopolitics of the day. Argentina was invited, but then the leader, Javier Milei, pulled out in December. So we're left with BRICS 10, but it might only be 9. How do these fit? So there's a BRICS now, BRICS Plus, you could call it a BRICS 9 or BRICS 10. Let's just call it BRICS. The BRICS fit into a bigger network that meets next month in Rio de Janeiro. It's called the G20. You can see here our greatest cartoonist, right? Jonathan Zapiro, gives you a sense of the debates about emissions within the G20 when you get the G7, led by the United States and the European powers, with the others, the new members that came in especially 2008, when the G7 realized it needed more financial resources to bail out Western, especially US banks. US banks had overexposed themselves in home mortgage markets and the mortgage bonds. So they needed bailouts. They needed to do the things called quantitative easing. They needed to expand the IMF. By the way, who was in charge of expanding the IMF in March, April 2009? Who gathered the arguments in the committee in the IMF? None other than the South African finance minister, Trevor Manuel, at the closing days of the Motlanthe government and into the Zuma government. And he became planning minister and was succeeded by the late Pravin Gordhan. But you see the sense here that there's really only one African country in the G20. Now, last year, the African Union was added to the G20. So it's not just that's that. But the main point about this with the African presence is it's been up to South Africa to represent Africa. My position is that South Africa represents Africa really badly. South Africa is a sub-imperial power whose corporates exploit Africa, right? That's undeniable, and whose army usually goes into places like the Central African Republic in 2013, the DRC for the last 15 years, Mozambique between 2021 and earlier this year. They were pushed out. But our SANDF usually goes into the rest of Africa to help the looters in the Central African Republic, unveiled as being connected to Chancellor House, the looters in Cabo Delgado, Mozambique, where we had 1,200 troops defending against the Al-Shabaab insurgent Muslim attacks on Total Energies, ExxonMobil, China National Petroleum Corporation, together with ExxonMobil and Eni, the Italian company. Now those, let's say, imperial, sub-imperial relationships in extractivism get very serious in the DRC. So the South African troops have just been moved a few weeks ago out of Cabo Delgado, out of Mozambique. They didn't do a very good job. The Rwandans really have carried the, let's say, sub-imperial mandate to protect Total's $20 billion facility in the Afungi Peninsula, where the third largest methane gas field in the world is. Total is now offering to bring that blood methane, because it comes from a war, to here in Johannesburg, because the pipeline that was set up from Mozambique here to Johannesburg via the Vaal complex, that pipeline of Sasol is running out of the source. So it may be that Total brings us blood methane. And the SANDF was part of that sub-imperial relationship to the extraction. Of course, northern Mozambique has the worst cyclones in the world, and they killed thousands, right? The Cyclone Idai, Cyclone Kenneth, Cyclone Freddy, and others. Now, the point about this is that we'll look at the BRICS in relation to imperial climate power in three ways in the next 20 minutes or so, if that's fine. I will go in about, well, let's say 10 minutes. So very quickly, and I'll pick this story up at 3 o'clock. What is the agenda of the BRICS in the global climate process? Number one, never commit to making the emissions cuts that are going to be required, because to do so puts your industry at a disadvantage. Let me just push ahead to see today in the Business Day a headline: China's appetite for thermal coal drives up the prices. And indeed, the price recently has been going up and up and up for coal from Richards Bay. The second is never admit that you owe a climate debt, and therefore you can erase a polluter pays logic. Now, that logic is a reasonable one. It's in all of our national environmental management laws and regulations. But that ends that responsibility of the polluter to pay. Let me call it an ecological reparations liability or a climate debt. That ends, according to the West and the BRICS together, when it comes to climate. And that debt denialism was actually codified in the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement. It contains a clause which absolves the signatories of any responsibilities for covering the loss and damage or adaptation expenses due to the past or even the future emissions. Now, the third is the most heartbreaking. It's to privatize the air. The West and the BRICS believe that you can profit from a public-private plundering process, which is to take the right to pollute and put it up for sale so the rich countries' corporates can buy the air, and we would never then industrialize in the poorer parts of the continent. And that would allow carbon markets, emissions trading, and offsets. And I will explore those in a little bit more depth, perhaps after 3 o'clock, when we have our broader debate about this BRICS sub-imperialism. But just to give you a sense of it, the imperial face of the carbon markets that I know is a man called Ken Newcomb. There he is. Now, Ken Newcomb is under arrest or has been charged, I'm not sure the exact status, for cheating. And his cheating now involves a South African who is perhaps well known to some of you online who know South Africa, Mandy Rambaros. Now, she was Eskom's climate officer under Andre de Ruyter. In fact, she worked for 14 years while Eskom was building Medupi and Kusile, the biggest coal-fired power plants under construction in the world. And she represented South Africa in international talks on carbon market negotiations. Now, I know all those carbon market negotiators. I know the South African delegates. They all did us in. I can go through names and addresses. I can show you in 2009 where the great negotiator for the G77 plus China, named Lumumba Diaping, actually raised the problem that the South African negotiators were working against the G77's interest. It is a classic role, especially for some of the South Africans who rise up within our high pollution industries. Well, how much is Eskom a polluter? With 85% of our energy coming from their coal-fired power plants, with 40% of the country's emissions, over 200 megatons a year. You know that Mandy Rambaras had to play a very serious con man role in that agency. So she just simply picked it up. And as the most important, let me say, internal self-regulating arbiter of the carbon markets, what the Financial Times reports this week is that she's now said that having Ken Newcomb on the board of her non-profit, okay, they take their profit out in other ways, NGOs. So those non-profit agencies that sort of self-regulate the carbon markets, she then said, no, it's fine for Ken Newcomb, Goldman Sachs, carbon marketeer. We knew him in the World Bank when he came down to push the worst carbon market pilot, I think, ever, which was the Durban-Bosasa Road methane to electricity project, which just completely failed by all accounts. So I'll talk about that if anyone wants. But what she says, no, it's just fine to have guys like Ken Newcomb right in the driver's seat. That means when we go to looking at the power relations and the self-interest, I'm not surprised to see South Africa right up there as a junior partner, always signing off. And before I go to leave you, just for a moment where you'll just join me in a debate on democracy now about the broader BRICS, here's a couple of reflections. Picture tells 1,000 words, doesn't it? And Sapiro again nails it, because I felt that before 2002, we weren't too sophisticated when it came to these elite projects. Again, number one, don't cut emissions. Number two, don't admit that you emitted. In other words, don't admit you've got a climate debt. Number three, privatize the air. Now, what we saw was something that continues. So we talk about it three, because we have 5 climate justice movements in South Africa, 5 different currents with slightly different ideologies, not very, but lots of different turf wars and divisions of labor. But the big problem from the Johannesburg World Summit on Sustainable Development, where corporates came in, was this divide and conquer that was very effective by the corporates, and they began to use all the sort of language of climate action, of sustainable development. And the leader of the UN at the time, a Ghanaian, Kofi Annan, had already had to sell out the UN through what's called a global compact, because George W. Bush, the US president, wouldn't sign on to basically pay the dues. In fact, at one point, Bush put in as the UN ambassador a man called John Bolton, whose philosophy, he said it out loud, let's blow up the top 8 floors of the UN. And that means that the corporate power, and we've been seeing it in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, Conference of the Polluters every year, including in Durban. And we saw it already in 2002, where particularly the likes of Alec Erwin, the then trade minister, just would not allow the idea of climate change to be raised, even in the World Summit in Sandton. And we had 30,000 people marching against that, right? Along with the World Conference Against Racism, a big march to show that poverty and racism are connected, a protest march of about 10,000 the year before. This was an extraordinary moment of 30,000 marching against the WSSD. Don't forget, we were facing in Johannesburg water privatization by Suez. We were facing the privatization of the air as the Durban pilot, and a woman called Sajida Khan fighting against that pilot became high profile. We fast forward to 2009, and then I'm going to leave you in a couple of minutes, but let's just look at quickly the ways in which the West and the BRICS got together in the climate negotiations, because the man at the top, Barack Obama, yes, raised in Hawaii, he was born there, and he has a Kenyan father, a wonderful Marxist who passed away early, but Barack Obama Sr., when I talk to my Kenyan comrades, they say, oh yeah, that guy, he was one of our great Marxists. Unfortunately, Barack didn't inherit that gene. And he barged into this meeting where 4 leaders of the basic, B-A-S-I-C, B for Brazil, and then S for South Africa, and then India and China. So the basic countries were meeting by themselves, and Obama knew Edward Snowden revealed, because the National Security Agency, his secret spies, were actually tapping the telephones of the other leaders. So he said, I know where they're going to be. And he barged in and he said, here's my 2-page Copenhagen Accord. Now, he left in 2017. Lula's back. Jacob Zuma left in 2018 under such a cloud and wants to come back. Wen Jiabao left in 2012. Manmohan Singh in 2014. They're long gone, with the exception of Lula. But look at the damage that they did. What they agreed upon was to basically slap each other on the back and replace the Kyoto Protocol, which had binding provisions that if you're in, you're in, and you have to actually comply. And Barack Obama said, look, I've got a Republican Senate. I've got a Republican threat. They're climate denialists. So let's not make this a proper treaty. We'll just call it the Accord, and we'll get our system in the US to start very vaguely, gradually decarbonizing. And they did do a bit of decarbonization, mainly through phasing out coal. But the problem is that this is a group that said a bottom-up. They used George Orwell's sort of inspiration to say, this is the kind of group that we want to basically combine the West and the middle-income countries, basic. Now, there was no Russia. Vladimir Putin, long-standing leader of Russia, wasn't in the house. But the point is, this is the sort of, let me call it, imperialist and sub-imperialist fusion. And I'll leave you with that simply by looking at why they would do this. And the answer is they're all massive emitters, whether from fossil fuels or, in the case of mainly Brazil with its Amazon devastation, land use changes that create CO2 or that can no longer sequester CO2. So I hope you get the message here that this imperial and sub-imperial alliance is very powerful, 15 years in the making. And I'd like to talk after 3 p.m. about some of the nuances, because there's one very interesting contradiction. The people from the emerging markets who are industrial and high carbon at the table today are basically against the West. The BRICS do have a genuine grievance, and the grievance is climate sanctions. And the climate sanctions will take the form of the carbon border adjustment mechanism. Now, that's my objective, is to come back and really explore the contradictions. But that means I have to leave just at this very moment. Sikho, I'm hoping before we can get Fredson or one of the others to make the link to New York, and then I'll be there with you, yes, that you might gather some questions and comments and see what people are thinking about it while we get that link up and running. Is that fine?
Yes, that's fine. Thank you, Patrick.
I'll see you soon.
Thank you. Sigiwe, are you able to live stream from Patrick?
This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We end today's show with the summit of BRICS nations that concluded Thursday in the Russian city of Kazan as President Putin made a comeback to the global stage, hosting 36 world leaders and representatives from countries including China, India, South Africa, Iran, even Palestine. Israel's war on Gaza took center stage, with many heads of states demanding an immediate ceasefire. Putin also faced direct calls at the summit from some of Russia's most important allies for Moscow to end the war in Ukraine. Meanwhile, the BRICS coalition, which was founded by Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, officially added 13 new nations to the alliance's partner countries, including Bolivia, Cuba, Nigeria, and Turkey. For more, we're joined by 2 guests here in New York. Richard Wolff, Professor of Economics Emeritus at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, visiting professor in the graduate program in International Affairs at the New School, founder of Democracy at Work, author of several books, including most recently Understanding Capitalism. And in Johannesburg, South Africa, we're joined by the political economist Patrick Bond, distinguished professor and director of the Center for Social Change at the University of Johannesburg. His recent Counterpunch article headlined Rising Dangers of Imperial and Sub-Imperial Partnering. We're going to begin with you, Patrick. Talk about the significance of this BRICS summit.
I must quickly say thank you for having me, but also in 10 or 11 days, you may know whether the great teams at Democracy at Work and Democracy Now! Need to be in exile, because democracy won't be allowed, and you'll come to Johannesburg and we'll have you a very fine site for your production systems. It's a great address here at the moment. And I think the fact that we had the BRICS summit just 14 months ago, I was chatting and debating with Vijay Prashad along with my colleague Trevor Ngwani. And it means that in the current period, where the de-dollarization rhetoric coming up to this BRICS, because Russia hosting it and being shut out of the SWIFT system, having $600 and some billion seized illegally by the Western banks and not getting loans, even from the BRICS New Development Bank, suffering sanctions. That meant a lot of attention has been on whether Vladimir Putin and his team can generate a de-dollarization strategy. Unfortunately, that didn't transpire. And then since we've just come out of the Israeli genocide story, not using genocide in the Kazan Declaration on Wednesday night, not calling for sanctions, even though the United Nations General Assembly effectively did last month, and not acknowledging that 9 out of the 10 BRICS countries have very profitable relationships, like South Africa, #1 coal exporter to Israel, and China and India having companies that run the Haifa port. You could turn those off and really put pressure on Israel if they really had the guts, but we see them talking left, walking right.
And Richard Wolff, your takeaway from this BRICS summit, how historic was it?
In my judgment, and even though Patrick is right about a number of his criticisms, this is a historic turning point. I cannot overstress it. Here we have, for the first time in a century, a serious economic competitor to the United States and its role in the world. We've never seen this before in the lifetimes you, me, and the people watching this program and listening to it. Here are a group of countries that together have a larger GDP, a greater production than the G7, the United States and its allies. We haven't had that before, and the gap between them is growing. The economic growth of the United States this year by the IMF is scheduled to be 2.8%. In China, 4.8%. In India, 7%. So they are growing faster than we are. They've been doing it for decades. It is a new economic world. And as an economist and an American, I am aghast that our presidential election isn't putting that front and forward. This is a new world. Everybody else in the world is adjusting to this reality. The American empire and our system is in a decline relative to what the BRICS are about. Are there problems among them? For sure. Do they have their faults? Absolutely. This is not good and bad, but it is a radical alteration. And if we continue as a nation to pretend it isn't happening or it isn't important, we will continue to make big strategic mistakes, not the least of which is to bring us into a war kind of situation that people are already sensing might be in the air.
I want to go to Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, for his comments at the BRICS summit.
We're in touch with the leadership of Iran in a very close contact. We see our role in creating conditions to settling the situation by finding mutual compromises. I think it is possible.
Patrick Bond, your response, the Russia-Iranian alliance, and also the latest news that North Korea is sending soldiers to Russia, perhaps to fight in Ukraine.
Well, those conflicts, Russia, Ukraine, are just so tragic, since several 100,000 Ukrainian working class people and maybe 100,000 Russians have been killed in what is a power grab that I think goes outside my line of argument, that it's a sub-imperial, it's a rogue sub-imperial, the way Janet Yellen's rogue imperial grab of all those assets could be described. But, you know, if I come back to where Richard was saying that this is an alternative, it's something new, it's a real challenge, I must fight you on that, my old friend, because I think there's not an anti-imperial, but a sub-imperial, not against, but within. Just think of the global value chain. My phone that has the cobalt from child labor in China, in Chinese mines in the eastern DRC, then coming back into a Western phone. And these are the sorts of relationships we really have to be restructuring, not just a sort of shifting of the deck chairs on a global capitalist Titanic. Certainly as the multilateral system expands. Next month, there will be, a G20. Last year in Delhi, the African Union was added. As it expands to have more legitimacy without changing the IMF and the World Bank and the WTO in any substantive way, the BRICS are playing a greater role. I think in amplifying the worst aspects. Just as one final example, the 51% of global emissions come from these 10 countries, but they only produce 29% of GDP. What it means is the BRICS Next month, go to Azerbaijan for the COP29. I'm sure Democracy Now! As usual, will go there and do cutting-edge analysis. You'll find that the BRICS and the West are tightly allied against the rest of us.
Last word goes to Richard Wolff.
Yeah, history does not happen in a morality play. You're not going to have the bad disappear and replaced by the good. It's never worked that way. What you have to have is an analysis of what's actually going on. And the unanimity, the dominance of the United States is over. And the whole world is trying to figure out, every company in the world, every country, how do you navigate a new international order? The United States is pretending that, as a nation, it doesn't have to worry about this. And I'm afraid Patrick's remarks will lead people to think, well, there's problems on their side too, which there are, but that misses the larger historical phenomena. This is the first serious economic competition this country has faced, and the consequences of that will be overwhelming to us.
We want to thank you both for being with us. Richard Wolff, economics professor, visiting professor at the New School, and Patrick Bond, professor at the University of Johannesburg. That does it for our show. Yes, Democracy Now! Will be in Baku, Azerbaijan, covering the UN Climate Summit in mid-November. And tune in on election night, Tuesday, November 5th, for a 4-hour Democracy Now! Election special, War, Peace, and the Presidency. Join us from 8 p.m. to midnight Eastern, and any television or radio station can take the broadcast as well. We'll also be airing an expanded 2-hour election show on Wednesday, November 6th. That does it for our show. Check out our job listings at democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us.
Would it be useful for me to just quickly sum up those points I was trying to make? You know, you're under a lot of pressure and you don't get to say everything properly, but so many of them do revolve around this question of the BRICS and their climate politics. So I want to just maybe take another 5 minutes. Is that acceptable, Cher, before we go to a lot of good debate?
That's completely fine. That's completely fine, Patrick.
Sikho, one day I'm going to get your chairing skills. I'm just a 20th century, what did we call ourselves, digital immigrant. I'm sure you're digital native. You had no trouble at all. I see that there are one or two questions that are just coming up. What does it mean to be sub-imperial? So let me first just sum up my attempt, which is there in the show with Amy and my old friend Rick. You know, we Marxist economists, we love to let's say dabble, debate and all the rest of it. Are you seeing a screen that has, I hope it's going to just have 5 little bullet points. So let me make those 5 points, which I do with Richard occasionally online, and we talk and chat, and he doesn't, as you heard, he doesn't really dispute these. The first is that in the G20, the imperialist powers, which are, let me use the way our dearest comrade Rosa-Luxemburg described imperialism. I can come back to the lovely details of her book, The Accumulation of Capital. It rings so true, much better than Lenin's 1916 imperialism. In 1913, Rosa knew that there was an imperialism that didn't just operate the way Lenin described, right? The 5 features that had institutions. There were internecine battles between countries, their capitalists, the hinterland colonies. She had a bigger story, which was the capitalist system meeting the non-capitalist, and to use her phrase, eating it up. And that's where the G20 and the other multilateral institutions, and I here specify multilateral, but they're Western control, not just Washington, not just the Pentagon, as Vijay Prashad and his team would emphasize, but really it's a multilateral system of capitalism. And what that capitalism today does, especially in terms of its climate politics, is to eat up the non-capitalists. So she read Saul Plaatje, right, the great writer from the early 20th century, her friend Olive Schreiner, and a British Keynesian leftist of sorts named John Hobson. They wrote some extraordinary works about how South Africa was emerging with migrant labor, with the diamonds in Kimberley and the gold here in Johannesburg. And so she was able to figure out how a system that included racist and sexist migrant labor also would eat up nature. And she described that in chapter 27 of Accumulation of Capital. Let me know if anyone wants the raw details, because I think she just nailed it so much better than any of her peers, Lenin, Hilferding, Bukharin, even Grossman a little later. Now, That means the multilateral system goes in and eats up. Now, sometimes we fight back. So we've got AIDS medicines against imperialism in the year 2001 in Doha, Qatar, at the World Trade Organization. It was one of those flukes where, because the United States had itself violated intellectual property of Bayer in getting an anthrax antidote, Ciprox, in September of 2021. Why was that? There were attacks on several notables in the US, media and politicians, with anthrax. So they went to Germany and said, we need compulsory licenses. The terminology is not important. But what we got in 2001, thanks to the Treatment Action Campaign, Médecins Sans Frontières, Oxfam, AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, social forces, movements, advocacy, and activists and protests, what we got was an IP waiver on AIDS medicines. What was the effect? We went from a life expectancy here in South Africa of 52 in the early 2000s up to 65 just before COVID. Cyril Ramaphosa learned from that. Narendra Modi, who hosts the Third World's Pharmacy, right? All of these big companies like Cipla that do generics. So they wanted an IP waiver on COVID vaccines. They didn't get it. To me, that was imperialism. And the one little attempt to go against it, it was, by the way, Angela Merkel, the German, and Boris Johnson, the Brit, who were the main people stopping the COVID-19 IP waiver, which prevented us from producing the COVID vaccines here in South Africa or all over Africa, which meant the big pharma corps profited massively. And we had 300,000 deaths. Maybe a couple 100,000 of those could have been prevented. That's the extent to which a G20 should have done something, but didn't. A World Health Organization should have done something, but didn't. And South Africa, even though it tried, it was anti-imperialist in that instance, fell up against two countries, China and Russia, which had their own COVID vaccines. They weren't very good compared to the mRNA, but they didn't really help. And Brazil, under Bolsonaro, the right-wing fascistic leader, went against us. A second feature of this imperialism and sub-imperialism, global and local financial power. Do you remember I said the BRICS New Development Bank put sanctions on Russia in March 2022 after Putin invaded? And the failure to de-dollarize, I saw in this city, Joburg, with Sim Chabalala, the head of Standard Bank, and Enoch Godongwana, the finance minister, and the Sikho Kganyago, the Reserve Bank governor, all telling the BRICS leaders the day before the BRICS meeting started here in Sandton, August 22nd of 2023, we can't do de-dollarization. We're too tied to New York, effectively. And the BRICS New Development Bank sanctions against Russia was because they look to Standard & Poor's, Fitch, and Moody's to rate them and therefore to get cheaper money. So those are the power relations. Our ruling classes are partly Western gazing. They're absolutely inappropriate for the times we're in. We need to de-dollarize, of course. The BRICS aren't going to be the vehicles. The third are the global value chains I mentioned that give us ultra-looting, not just colonial and neo-colonial looting, but it's even worse when you look at the extent to which BRICS companies, along with Western companies, as I said, Cabo Delgado, Mozambique, some of the examples I've used, I can give you many more, show a tight alliance between the West and the BRICS in looting the continent to put products into the global value chain, with complications such as the new tariffs that Europe and the US have put onto Chinese electric vehicles and batteries and solar panels. I've mentioned this profiteering. South Africa, with our huge coal reserves, some probably close to, we've probably got 40 billion tons of coal, and about 47 million tons last year was exported. The peak was 70 million tons a year. That does enormous destruction, but the worst destruction from our coal, Glencore's coal. Patrice Motsepe is the partner. Cyril Ramaphosa used to be the Glencore partner in the old days when he was chairing the Optimum mine. And that coal goes right into the incinerators in which Israel commits genocide. There's just no other way to describe South Africa's massive profiteering from selling coal to Israel. We were number 3 for several years, roughly 12 to 15% of an annual coal consumption by Israel came from South Africa. And Colombia was number 1 and Russia number 2. But what's just happened in August this year is the president of Colombia, his name is Gustavo Petro, he said no more coal from Glencore and an American company going to Israel. So Glencore just said, oh, it's okay, we'll get it from Richards Bay. So we've seen all these ships, at least 3 ships, full of 167,000 tons of coal, each shipment, going around. They don't dare go through the Red Sea and the Suez Canal, the short route, do they? Because that would put them at the victim of basically Houthis who say, hey, you're providing coal to Israel. We can track your ships. And they would sink, as a Russian ship was sunk by the Houthis not long ago with a huge load of coal sitting at the bottom of the Red Sea. So that profiteering, Brazil, 9% of Israel's oil comes from Petrobras. Petrobras is trying now to come and offshore drill in South Africa. No regard for the climate, even though next year Lula will host the big climate summit, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change Conference of the Polluters, number 30. He's also approved more offshore oil drilling just where the Amazon River meets the Atlantic Ocean. Just shocking. And then you've got
Patrick.
Yes, should I wrap up?
Yes, can I stop you there?
Yes, please. I can just do a very final note that it's climate and biodiversity-based planetary destruction. Would we like to, I could show a couple more pictures that show how this BRICS relationship to climate policy is degrading our planet and our societies. But just the one last word should go to this great negotiator, Africa's most militant, I think, defender, Lumumba Diaping, head of the G77. If you allow me, just this one last sentence, because Lumumba really just said it straight in Copenhagen, right at the time that picture I showed you was taken. Many African delegations come to the climate summit unprepared. Some members are lazy or being bought off by the industrialized nations. Lumumba Diaping, according to Adam Wells, who was the reporter, very reliable voice on this, Lumumba singled out South Africa, saying that members of that delegation had actively sought to disrupt the unity of the bloc. That's the Subimperial position against the African continent. There's no denying it. Let's open it up for questions. How would you like to proceed?
Thanks, Patrick. Thank you so much for the presentation. I think let's take one question each and then you answer. 3 to 5 minutes, Patrick.
You know, my occupational hazard is babbling. You have to stop me, I think.
Okay, cool. I'll stop you, Patrick. So I think it would be better if I just read the question for you and then you go ahead and answer it, and then we go to the next one. So I'll take one from Lisa Thompson, who says, what is your view, Patrick, of Professor Wolff's comments, Wolff's about the turning point we are on geostrategically?
You know, I love Rick Wolff. He's like back in the day when I was a kid, trying to figure out, should I be a Marxist economist in Amherst or New York, or I chose Baltimore with David Harvey. Rick and his team have been so strong in tracking the end of empire. And so you do get the latest data on his show about decline in the US, even though they have a hot economy, low unemployment, but it's beneath the glitter rot. I don't dispute any of it. And for Lisa, I mean, I think the dilemma is whether the US, in its management of this decline, will assimilate. And that's what I would argue. And Rick disagrees with me. He thinks there's a big confrontation coming. There may be some big wars. But I think the tendency with intercapitalist penetration is actually for us to see much more of that. Let's call it, let me put it the way Barack Obama did. He was asked by The Economist magazine in 2014. 2014 is different than, today's 10 years later. But I think it still holds. He said, I would rather have the Chinese pissing outside the tent from inside than pissing inside the tent from the outside. And what he did, and what Xi Jinping very happily was able to do, he got the baton. And you can see that in 2017 in the World Economic Forum, the meeting just a couple of days before Donald Trump, in his first term, I hope his last term, in his first term, he was inaugurated. And Xi Jinping came out with the most neoliberal manifesto. He spoke at Davos, Switzerland, to the World Economic Forum. Much of the subsequent years have been about all sorts of contested, the Yankees, especially Trump, putting on lots of protectionist barriers for Joe Biden to take what's a BYD electric car, now far better than our homeboy Elon Musk can make, and far, far cheaper, right? And now to put 100% tariff on. In other words, to charge an American who wants to go to, away from petrol to go to electric. This is absolutely insane. And the extent to which some of these little, let's call them just petty tariffs are being imposed. But may I just end this 3 minutes with one exception? There is an area where I do believe in tariffs, and it's called a carbon border adjustment mechanism. What is that? Unfortunately, we're going to learn about CBAM. CBAM, I always have to remind people, it's sore, this CBAM, because the Europeans will hit us with a protective tariff because our ESCOM, coal-fired products, let's say steel and aluminium and manganese and other smelted metals, and our cars and all those metals and all those heavy industrial, high carbon intensive and high capital intensive products. There aren't not many jobs associated with them. Those products, when they go to Europe, will be hit with a tariff because Europe has basically a $70 a ton carbon tax. It's called the emissions trading scheme. I could go on about why that privatized air is a nonsense, but nevertheless, it's an important, let's say, preliminary tax on carbon. And we need to have that. What's our carbon tax? I don't know if anyone knows in the audience. You can write it down, but I'll tell you. I mean, it's 39 US cents. It's about R6.60 on average, our carbon tax. So 39 US cents versus $70. Of course, the Europeans are going to put on tariffs because we, let's say, our leading corporates, you know, your Enoch Godongwana, who's the tax man, and the Minister of Mineral Resources, Gwede Mantashe, even President Ramaphosa, they're essentially climate denialists. They're not climate denialists, but Ramaphosa will acknowledge that if the West starts Europe in 2026, UK 2027, maybe a Kamala Harris government after that, what they do, they put on a tax against ESCOM energy that's embedded in our industrial products. Now, if you're in organized labor, and especially in the metal workers, the mine workers, whether ANCU or NUM, if you're a third worldist, this is not a good idea. I'm not sure what Rosa-Luxemburg's foundation is. If you're a community movement activist against these big petrochemical or steel or aluminium plants in your neighborhood, you're probably for this. If you're an eco-socialist, you're probably for it. If you're an economist, you might even be for it because you don't want the outsourcing of emissions. You don't want this cheating of internal, an externality that is pollution that isn't paid for. I think this is one of the great debates of our time. You'll all probably in the House start picking this up, but I think it's one of those ways, Lisa, to answer that question, that the West will start to, let's say, resurrect the powers they have, the World Trade Organization, and of course the IMF and World Bank. They'll assimilate, and there'll be sites of conflict like the one I've just said. But by and large, the overall approach to managing global capitalism will be sustained. And the last point on that is the unity that the West and the BRICS Plus, as written down on Wednesday, this very last sentence, they are both united in opposing the Houthis, because the Houthis have cut off the Red Sea effectively as a route for 12% of world trade. And if you're a global capitalist, whether you're an imperialist in the West or a sub-imperialist in the BRICS, you don't like that, even though the Houthis are really doing probably the most effective work, along with our BDS activists, in raising the cost of genocide to Israel.
Thanks, Patrick. The next question, Malcolm Ray, one of Rosa's seminal contributions to the debate on imperialism and her difference with Lenin and Bukharin was her brilliant assertion that imperialism manifests as market and non-market economies combined. BRICS has positioned itself in the global south, much of which is non-market. How do you see BRICS' sub-imperialism playing out in the non-market sphere?
Wow, that's great, and Malcolm is UJ's finest up-and-coming Marxist theorist, and the Luxemburgist way of thinking about imperialism, as I mentioned, it really does boil down to a difference in understanding the depth of the power. And for Lenin, I also like reading Rudolf Hilferding, many of the others of that era. They didn't really see that imperialism was about systemic theft. Marx did. So if I just take that 2 minutes to say, primitive accumulation under Karl Marx was the original accumulation by which, for example, the enclosures in Britain entailed the lords coming and kicking the peasants off. But this is not just a once-off to start capitalism off. Apartheid didn't need, wasn't just useful to capitalism in South Africa for kickstarting it, as some would have argued, maybe if we're sitting 50 years ago in a seminar like this. Instead, it's a permanent process. And the question, I think, for Malcolm is back to you. Does this process get really serious during periods of capitalist crisis where the usual techniques of managing the crisis, for Marx, the speeding up, which he called absolute surplus value, or replacing workers with more efficient machines, relative surplus value, where David Harvey picks it up with a geographical fix, moving the problem around, a temporal fix, moving it over time. And the fifth of these, very important, let me call it crisis management techniques. We've been in this kind of capitalist crisis, especially since the 2008, but really even from the beginning of this century. And the dilemma for, I think, capitalism is, how do you continue to steal? And the best example of the stealing is what they do here. I mean, this city had half the world's gold, didn't it? And over time, it's been looted. That is resource extraction. And that's depleted wealth that never gets compensated properly. And that plus looting of women. How do you loot a woman? Through social reproduction surplus value that's produced by a worker, but the worker's looked after for free by a woman, right? And typically migrant labor amplifies that because the men are just paid a small pittance while they're in the hostels, as if they, compared to as if they had their family at home, where they'd have to be paid much more to reproduce the family. You see the importance of social reproduction in migrant labor. So in my 2 minutes, I think I've gone a bit more, but that to me is the extent to which what Malcolm's asking, did Rosa Luxemburg really have her finger on the pulse, reading, the likes of Saul Platje and Olive Schreiner and John Hobson about how South African capitalism was particularly wicked in delving deep into sources of the non-capitalist or the non-market and eating them up?
Thanks, Patrick. The next question is, what are your views on the role of Turkey in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? While opposing Israel in public, they are secretly supporting them. And the question goes on to say, Turkey recently announced it wanted to end the conflict with the Kurds. Then there is a terrorist attack in Turkey. And this is from John Devenish.
Well, and John's really watching this. Please look at bricsfrombelow.org, where John is posting as much as he can. And I know Erdogan just expects, to be a NATO member and a member of BRICS at the same time. It's mind-boggling, but that's what's up now for contestation, and that's what Erdogan asked Putin for this week. Erdogan did say, after being, quite a strong supporter and ally of Netanyahu before October 7, he did say, no, we have to chop. And I think it was because the strong Islamic citizenry in Turkey that was getting fed up with Erdogan playing both sides. But John's exactly right. You can say full sanctions against Turkish business, especially the facilitation of the Azerbaijan oil, the Kazakh oil that goes to Israel. It's a very, very important source of oil for them. And Turkey allows it. And Turkey's capitalists go to Cyprus, where there's a Turkish part of that island. And then they sort of say, no, we're going to now ship not from Turkey to Israel, but from Cyprus to Israel. They've got all the games. What's crucial, I think, John, isn't just Turkey, but that we get at least an acknowledgement that two countries, Turkey and Colombia, have said openly, without fear of a World Trade Organization, that we will have sanctions against Israel. Why is that terribly important for us? I mean, I talk a lot to our dear comrades in the BDS movement, and the BDS movement just ran into a problem last month. We need to stop the oil, the coal. We also have some diamonds and some grapes, a few other small things, but coal is by far the biggest export. And John, what not Turkey, but what Colombia really proved by chopping coal, chopping especially Glencore coal that goes to Israel, is that you don't need to worry about the WTO. And now we have this UN General Assembly, let's say, codification of the International Court of Justice statement in July, that we should have trade sanctions against Israel, where those trade relationships support Israel's illegal occupation. Coal into the grid certainly does so. Now, the dilemma is that we have a trade minister. The World Trade Organization has twisted his mind. His name is Parks Tao. He's replaced Ibram Patel and Rob Davies, who frankly were very little use. Rob Davies put on little disclosure. If you've got a product from the occupied territories, then you have to at least disclose it. And that was a big scandal, a debate about that. But now we need really serious BDS, the way we had against South Africa and the financial institutions were the Achilles heel in 1985. And this city went crazy when the banks said no more loans to the apartheid regime because of the popular protests, the internal contradictions. The Achilles heel for Israel probably is energy. South Africa is crucial because although Russia may take over as the number one supplier, Colombia used to be, currently Richards Bay shipments from Mpumalanga on the Transnet rail through the Transnet port, through the coal export terminal to the Hedera port, where the coal goes into the Orat Rabin power station and fuels genocide and fuels the occupied territories' illegal occupation. Those are the connections we have to make. And look, Parks Tau, when he replied in Parliament a month ago, he said, no, I can't do it. The WTO will declare this illegal. Now, that's the sub-imperial posture where Parks Tau, our minister, who used to be the Joburg mayor, is kowtowing to the WTO in an invented way. It's not even a real way, and saying, we're not going to hurt Israel where it counts because we don't want to offend global imperialist trade relations. And that's why when the BRICS, the very last word on this, sorry, the BRICS declaration, please read it, it's very interesting. But it starts by saying we want the WTO at the center of our world trading system without acknowledging these appalling features of the WTO.
Thanks, Patrick. A question from Mia Swart. How much is South Africa sacrificing in relation to human rights on the altar of anti-Americanism if BRICS is essentially about opposing the US?
It's so interesting because that's the rhetoric, to be against the West, the great upholders of human rights. But what? I don't call the West an upholder of human rights. I really never did. But right now, there's a better name. If you go to Washington and up to Ottawa and across to London and down to Brussels and over to Berlin and across to Paris and maybe go back to Tokyo and down to Canberra, what you find yourself in is not the West supporting human rights. You're in the axis of genocide. You're in the sites of Western power that are doing everything they can every day to empower Israel, right? So any discussion of South Africa having to respect human rights, or in this big conference that's scheduled for next month, perhaps to be protested, hopefully to be withdrawn from, the National Endowment for Democracy, that's the US, let's call it the soft power of imperialism, coming here, working with some foundations. I won't mention their names in the hope that they're all going to drop out. One or two have, but they're trying to continue this fiction. Now, the most important dilemma for anyone thinking about U.S.-South African relations is whether trading is going to be adversely affected by South Africa's playing this at least talk left role in the International Court of Justice. You remember about a year ago, the African Growth and Opportunity Act had a huge conference. It was in the Nasrec, and we had protests outside and all because the U.S. was supporting the genocide unfolding. But the crucial question that I hope we'll all get to ask, because we do Marxist political economy in Rosa's tradition, who wins and loses from the AGOA? And a year ago, when we asked that question, we said, well, who is actually exporting? Number one, Mercedes. Number two, BHP Billiton. Number three, ArcelorMittal, an Indian-owned company, but based in Luxembourg. Number four, Sasol, petrochems. And then you can go to some vineyards and so forth. But, and then don't forget Toyota and BMW and VW and Ford, right? Big car companies, big metals and steel, and big petrochem. Now, those guys use our electricity. Wow, do they use it? 42% of our electricity is consumed by just 27 companies. They even have a funny name that'll tell you. Energy Intensive Users Group. How many jobs do they create? 4%. 42% of electricity, 4% of jobs. So I think on that one, Mia, if we get punished by the damn Yankees in the Africa Growth and Opportunity, I do have a U.S. passport. You can tell from my accent that I did spend, unfortunately, a long time in the U.S. But if we get punished, it could be a great benefit if we can free up that electricity. And by the way, BHP Billiton, using 7% of our grid, only pays 30 cents a kilowatt hour. Did you guys look at your latest bill from Eskom or City Power, wherever you are? It's R2.80. So they're paying 1/8 the price. They import bauxite, they export the aluminium. This is a nonsense use. If we get sanctioned by the US for taking a strong position on Israel, I'd say that will be of benefit to this economy and to small businesses, labor-intensive industry, to households where, because of patriarchy, women are meant to cook, and if the electricity is not there, it's too expensive, while they do it with coal or wood or paraffin and kerosene, and then the particulate matter in the air and the role that oppression of women and the health implications becomes all the worse. So if we can free up electricity for women in the household, all households, especially low-income ones, and small businesses and labor-intensive industry, bring it on. Those sanctions will be of great benefit.
I will take 2 more questions, and then I think we can close the session. From Fritzen. Fritzen says, what does the Imperial and Imperial alliance mean to democracy globally?
I mean, this retreat from democracy from the West appears to be because of a rising proto-fascism. Half the United States electorate right now is saying they'll vote for a pretty openly fascistic candidate, Donald Trump, whose chief of staff this week said, yeah, he's a fascist. Now, the end of democracy in the US, I was telling Amy Goodman and Rick Wolf, bring their offices to Joburg if they need to be in exile, because we have fought hard for our democracy. And in this current context where there's a lot of fluidity, I think all of you will recognize we've done a lot of things properly by at least having the basics of one person, one vote in a unitary state, and getting rid of many of the if not all, but most of the racist laws and systems. Not systems, but at least the scaffolding of capitalism is less racist and more democratic. Now, the West is featuring not only a right wing, and probably I can confidently say a right wing that is empowered from a white working class, that's a labor aristocracy, as Lenin called this kind of crowd, white workers who've lost their jobs because of deindustrialization, because the corporates moved them to, from Michigan to Alabama to Mexico and east coast of China. Now those production systems maybe even go to Vietnam or Bangladesh. The manufacturing uneven development, or the global value chain shifting, has created a proto-fascist US electorate. What can be done about it? I mean, the most exciting thing I felt looking at the US in recent years was Bernie Sanders, a socialist, saying, you in the white working class, do you have problems with healthcare? Do you need a better, let's say, allocation of resources in your education systems, for example, free community colleges? And by appealing on class terms, there's an extraordinary potential. It was realized in 2017. Does anybody remember the year after Brexit in Britain? Jeremy Corbyn took over the leadership of the Labour Party and was able, in the general election, to take half of the fascists, the UKIP, United Kingdom Independence Party, took half of them over to Labour by putting class politics out. I spent a little time in Germany. I'm very worried about this AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland, the fascist party. There's a red-brown alliance around a woman who used to be a Rosa-Luxemburg Foundation, at least Die Linke leader. She left to found the Sacre Wagenknecht Alliance. And that alliance is doing very, very well, actually, preventing the AfD, the pure fascists, from making big gains. But I'm so worried about a red-brown politics. I think you could just be red and still capture many of them. All over Europe and the US, the threat to democracy comes from within, by neoliberal elites who lost the Social Democratic parties, the UK Labour Party, the US Democratic Party, from the early 90s. They just threw away their working class base and went for neoliberal corporate agenda. I'm very confident in saying that's the trend. Now, did the ANC do the same? Yeah, I think that's why they're down to 40%, because a populism of the left, but it might be of the right. I think there's a wonderful debate in South Africa. Is Jacob Zuma, Julius Malema, genuinely coming as populists from the left, or do they harbor other, let's say, less progressive politics deep inside them, like their totalitarian instincts or their corruption instincts, or all these other sorts of problems people have raised, ethnicism by MK and EFO. All these sorts of things are terribly important for us to say, how do we relate a fascistic movement to working class interests, and especially for climate. My dear comrades, I can't stress this enough, to get a just transition politics. So we don't see a right wing emerge, the yellow vests in France, for example, that will rise up, not because the yellow vests were right wing, but because they were subject to a carbon tax. And therefore, they had skepticism about whether climate addressed through state policies like carbon taxation. And it really does pose amazing problems for us as we figure out why our climate justice movements, maybe with one exception, or a couple, I mean, there's some very, very good trade unionists, and Rosa Luxemburg's been supporting them. But if I think of the Climate Justice Coalition, which has the SAF2 leadership involved, one of the great unions of our country, maybe the greatest small union, is GWUSA, General and Industrial Workers Union of South Africa. And when you kind of get those unions that can talk left, but also walk left, they can talk working class power and find ways of uniting with feminists and ecologists and community activists and the youth and eco-socialists, that to me is where we're going to see an antidote to a fascism that's partly a climate denialist fascism. You just see how far Donald Trump goes when he says that climate change is a hoax and he's going to drill, baby, drill. And, you know, you're beginning to feel bits and pieces of that sort of climate skepticism, even in our own trade unions. It's that much more important here, where we really have the potential of some supposed money in a just energy transition partnership. It's controlled by neoliberals, but, you know, to really make the case from trade unions combined with communities and environmentalists, not in opposition, the way, frankly, I think we are now. One of the 5 climate justice movements is advanced. That's the Climate Justice Coalition. The other 3 or 4 that I see in action could do a lot more, and I hope they do. And some of them, like the Climate Justice Charter Coalition, absolutely does on paper, and we'd love just to see the 5 movements: CJC, Climate Justice Charter Movement, Extinction Rebellion, and, you know, all of our little white middle class people who go and protest at Standard Bank. You know, there's a sort of network of very progressive climate justice activists who don't connect that well to the base, plus the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance, plus Life After Coal, which is driven partly by EarthLife Africa, very well grounded in some of the communities and groundwork, and NGO and Center for Environmental Rights. Did I get all 5? Some of you out there know the CJ scene better than I do. But I would love, and I always ask my dear comrades in each of these movements, hey, come on, let's come together. Let's find some unity. So workers, community, environment, youth really have a project together.
Thanks, Patrick. And perhaps as a last question, really relating to the CBAM that you spoke about earlier. You know, there is a critique out there with these new EU laws, CBAM, including the CSDDD, that it does strengthen and almost reinforce northern imperialism from the EU's part. And I'd just like to hear your thoughts about that critique of the laws.
Yes, in fact, I was with a Rosa team in Vienna just a month ago. So my carbon budget for the year and the century was just busted, but it was worth it. And the event was called the Euro Memo. And in that, and people can find it online or I'll share it, but I did a long paper, which will soon be published, about exactly this, the CBAM. Can I just keep doing this? I mean, people sort of seem to remember when I hit myself. That CBAM, or a cartoon, BAM, that carbon border adjustment mechanism, that can I even add to your point? It's not just imperialist, it's protectionist imperialist, right? But if you're looking at this from the standpoint of rationality and capitalism always externalizing its costs, you know that the goddamn capitalist system will outsource the pollution, the dirty industry, to the poorest people, or to South Africa, which has no standards, or 6.8 rand, 38 cents US per ton of carbon, whereas Europeans are pushing it up now around $70 a ton. So if the outsourcing is coming out of Europe and will end up in South Africa without a CBAM, to me, that's not progress. If BHP Billiton, with 1,200 workers using 7% of our grid, getting it at 30 cents a kilowatt hour instead of labor-intensive industry, small businesses, women in the households, if they keep producing, right, and take the electricity and create massive amounts of emissions, not just the carbon that goes in, because now Richards Bay might have some windmills installed. They announced yesterday, Tony Carney has a nice article. But if they use carbon dioxide intensive production techniques, process emissions, which they do, then I don't think we should host BHP Billiton. I think it should be shut down and that 7% of the electricity reallocated. It has no backward forward linkages. It just takes imported bauxite and sends back aluminium and the profits to Melbourne. So all the dear comrades in the house, maybe there's NUMSA in the house. I would love the just energy transition to give your 1,200 workers, if you're metal workers in NUMSA, all the funds to develop worker-controlled, managed, owned projects like alternative energy systems in Richards Bay, because they're desperately needed. And anybody going there knows that the most important thing you see are the overhead lines that carry gazillions of gigawatts, right, over the last 35, 40 years to BHP Billiton. And that's just not right. That's a terrible, inefficient waste. Finally, I'm always interested in whether our communities, our environmentalists, our women's groups, our youth, in places like, I was with VEJA, with the Val Environmental Justice Alliance on Tuesday, and one of the greatest trade unions, Stinga Sikwebu, was trying to manage a discussion about a green hydrogen. But I'm always curious where we will see these fantastic organic intellectuals from our base saying, actually, we're not just local, because our critique of the capitalist system's abuses of fossil fuels is not only that we get polluted on, it's not only that our depletion of raw minerals then gets picked up like coal, from KZN or in Mpumalanga, and gets washed with our precious water so it can be used to burn. And instead of future generations using the coal for lubricants or plastics or tarmac, things that don't need to be combusted. They're hydrocarbons that just get used in a non-combustible way. That's where the coal should be, in the ground until our future generations need it for hydrocarbons. And I think that the final point on this is that until we can get those community groups, and VEJA is about the best, Soweto Electricity Crisis Committee, South Durban Community Environmental Alliance, EarthLife Africa, you just see the kinds of arguments that are flowing from them in their fights with big mega polluters. If we just get much more attention now to saying, we've got all the money, 150 billion rand plus is in a fund in the presidency for a just transition. A neoliberal, mention her name if you like, but she's running it. We need to put lots of pressure to get that money, not on a loan basis, but on a grant basis to have alternatives. So if parts of VEJA parts of the Val, let's say Secunda, they need to shut down the #1 CO2 emitting point source in the world. It's the Secunda plant where Sasol squeezes coal the way the Nazis taught them to do, right? It's called the Fischer-Tropsch method. You squeeze the coal, you get a few drops of liquid petroleum. But we should import that petroleum. Hopefully we will soon be off petroleum addictions. And the point is that it's really only the communities and the environmentalists, progressive lawyers, really connecting to labor that's going to make a coalition like that possible. Otherwise, what we're going to see is what I saw the other day with the Sasol management, just smug and saying, we'll just keep polluting as much as we want, both local pollution and greenhouse gas emissions, and we'll get these people to support us if it comes to a CBAM, or we'll just export our steel to China. I mean, the dilemma is that, or petrochems or aluminium, the dilemma is, last word, the internecine capitalist tendencies of competition can never be suppressed. BRICS cannot suppress the most powerful force of destruction. It's overproduction by, at this point, a bunch of factories in the east coast of China. And to give you an illustration, it's not lefties and environmentalists shutting down South African steel because it's too polluting. It's imports from China because they overproduce. It's not that they overproduce solar and electric vehicles and batteries, which is the line from the Europeans. There's no such thing as overproduction. We need to get as much of that into our system as we can. We just need it as a public good, not as a commodity. But the real dilemma is that China is actually causing a capitalist crisis of overproduction, and that means our deindustrialization is going to get worse and worse. And don't take it from me. You can look at the International Trade Commission in Pretoria and look at all the brand new basically survival tariffs that they put. So to the question, is the European Union being protectionist, imperialist? Yeah. Do we need rationally to put on tariffs, not 6.8 rand per ton, right? But which is 38 cents, but $70 a ton. In other words, at least 20 times higher, or was it 200 times higher? And then can we get the local class forces aligned with community and workers and environmentalists and women and youth to make that happen so that they close those facilities and we redistribute the electricity? I know this is a complicated line of thinking, and the most tempting is to do what we started with in this seminar, to take Vijay Prashad and say, more third world production, end poverty now. But when you do a class analysis and an ecological analysis and a feminist analysis, then you think local and you think global and you act local and you act global. I hope I'm convincing you, dear comrades, that we can engage in all these battles and we can do it properly without the pitfalls of, let me call it campism, or that is pro-BRICS, or the sense that there is an alternative. When we look at a cold, hard way at the BRICS supplying Israel with number one coal source, South Africa, right? There will be some meetings in the next few days about that with the minister. Hopefully we change that. Number two, the global value chain that gives me this nice phone from child labor in the DRC, getting the cobalt and the coltan out. Number three, the multilateral institutions, including the UNFCCC, which is a conference of polluters, is not doing the job. It's called bullshit, the Paris Climate Agreement by the greatest climate scientist, James Hansen. And number four, in the ways in which we see BRICS companies operating in our different terrains, really in a class struggle. We're going to have to end any myth that this is a different sort of politics we're getting. And I hope when it comes to a debate that we just need to keep on having, the one you've allowed us to start, dear comrades, in Rosa-Luxemburg, which way to climate sanity? We're not redirected into defending South African heavy industry by defending big multinational corporates, which are BHP Billiton from Australia, ArcelorMittal from Luxembourg, Sasol, which is partly Joburg, but also partly New York, and on and on. The car companies, the petrochem, all of these things that are so destructive that we don't end up defending them simply because we hate European protectionist imperialism. That's our struggle, dear comrades. I think it's one that Rosa would join us in.
Thank you so much, Patrick, for joining us and for your very insightful presentation, and also for allowing us to tune into your debate as well with Richard Wolff. Thank you so much for being here. And also to our audience, thank you so much for joining us. This is the second last of a series of webinars, as I said in the beginning. And the next one is with Dr. Daniel Paget, who's a lecturer at the University of Sussex. It will be on the 8th of November, and it will also be virtual. It will be titled The People, Power, Philosophies, Imaginaries of Democracy Forged in Anti-Authoritarian Struggle. So please do join us for that last one. And also a big thank you to Fritzen for organizing this discussion, and also to Siviwe for all the technical support. And we hope to see you on the next one. Thank you so much, Patrick.
If I get just 10 seconds. A special thanks to Siviwe, because, trying to keep somebody like me online, but also very much to you, Sikho. But I also have to tell the crowd, it'll soon be Dr. Fredson, because I happen to read a doctoral thesis. It's magnificent. And if you want to learn why, Marx tells us so much about an ecological rift and the Egyptian discussion of an energy democracy by Tim Mitchell, all applied to Mozambique, partly by looking at South Africa. Well, Fredson, when is this great work of yours turned into a book so we can all get access to it? I hope your revisions on the Wits International Relations doctoral thesis are as successful as you're doing in all the rest of your work. Thanks, dear
Amazing.
comments.
I'm sure we'll have a webinar for Fredson as well, Patrick, when he eventually makes it a book. So thank you so much for that. Fredson, I think you wanted to say something?
I just wanted to say thanks for Patrick. Thank you so much for everyone. Thank you for you as well, Sikho. Thank you. I knew we could rely on you for this. You did it great. Thank you so much. Thanks to you as well. Patrick, I've got no words to appreciate. And thank you for the other participants. And like Sikho said, see you on the 8th, hopefully. Thank you so much. Enjoy your weekend, everybody.